Welcome to Sidebar. This is Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, as well as partners at Bracewell, where we represent companies, board of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigations, and enforcement actions. Phil, who do we have as our guest today?
We have our colleague, Rachel Goldman.
I don't think that's music. I think that may be
Probably
construction.
A saw. And this is from my basement. I mean, think how delightful this is when it's right outside my window. Hold on. I think it stopped. All right. Hold on. No, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go even deeper.
You have a basement for your basement?
I have.
I know you're constantly having construction and things built on your house.
He's going into his bunker.
I am going into my bunker.
He has a zombie bunker.
I'm a Northwest survivalist.
You could be in there for months.
Wow, this isn't creepy at all.
All right, folks.
Okay.
We're not even bothering to go to the garage full of marijuana. Rachel, disregard that. That's from last episode.
Put this way, Phil's soon going to be our former colleague.
We've been saying that for a very long time.
He's been saying that for a long time.
We've been saying that for a long time. He hasn't managed to cross the Rubicon yet.
All right. Today we're going to talk about something everyone seems to be talking about. ESG. What is ESG? It stands for Environment, Social, and Corporate Governance, which I guess is C rather than G, but it says governance, so it's governance. And it can mean a lot of different things. To help us figure it out, we have our colleague, Rachel Goldman, with us. And Rachel is an accomplished litigator who started her career with the city of New York and then joined our firm in 2005. She made an early misstep, and that was hiring me. She spent the last 15 years atoning for it and litigating countless corporate governance related cases in state and federal court, in bankruptcy court, and in arbitration. Rachel, thanks for joining us. We're happy to have you with us today.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I am happy to talk about ESG.
But before we do so, you realize that 15 years of atonement for hiring Phil isn't enough. Like, it's not done.
I know. I keep trying to make up for it, and it just doesn't seem like anything I do is enough. So all I can do is live one day at a time.
Well, we'll use the next 30 minutes to credit your account for at least that amount of time.
That's true. You do owe me, Phil.
All right. So I guess aside from the actual words, Rachel, can you help us figure out sort of really what is ESG? How does someone define this thing?
Well, sort of like you said at the beginning, Phil, ESG can mean a lot of different things, and it means different things to different people depending on who you ask. But I think probably the best general definition of ESG, in addition to the words environmental, social, and governance, is a combination of a variety of factors that companies are or should be taking into account when making strategic business, investment, and operational decisions. It's informing not only the decisions companies are making about current operations and future planning, but also informing investors, regulators, shareholders, the public, customers, and consumers of their products. So it really does run the gamut of who's interested and why they're interested. But at bottom, it really is just taking a look at the decisions that companies are making and how they're making them for now and for the future.
Can you give us some examples of like what we're talking about here? I mean, obviously environmental is probably fairly easy to figure out, but what are some other areas that this covers?
I think that's right, Matthew. Environmental is probably the easiest to figure out, and just starting there, the simplest way to explain that is probably the impact that a company's activities has on the environment, and then taking into account climate change and what's happening in the environment and what companies are doing to prepare for climate change. The social is a little bit more fluid. It's not as clear to everyone what social really is. One way to think about it is human capital, the employees of a company, the leaders of the company, the labor and workforce in a company, and the relationship the company has with its employees and how it interacts with them and the policies in place. Another aspect of social would be human rights, health and safety. It could also be supply chain management for companies who have supply chain issues in other parts of the world, especially, and how those companies from which they receive their goods handle their relationships with their employees. For governance, it is sort of what Phil said, which is corporate governance, but it's a little broader than what maybe has been traditionally thought about in the sense of accounting or financial controls. It also has to do with how the company is actually run, the accountability of the company, again, policies, procedures, the role of leadership in implementing those policies and procedures and being held accountable for them. And overriding all of that is also just the reporting of these issues, the disclosures to the public, both the investing public and the consuming public, so that there is transparency and accountability for the companies when they say they're going to be doing something, or they are involved in certain things, or they will institute certain policies and live up to certain ideals, that in fact they are doing that. So there's a wide variety of aspects of ESG, and those are some of those examples.
So, Rachel, it sounds like if you were going to put sort of a big heading over this, it's an instruction or desire or directive to just kind of be good, which sounds nice and sort of makes me wonder, why now? Why is it important to be good now? And why is it that this is sort of something that didn't happen a long time ago, or is there something that happened recently that has kind of made this a big thing that we weren't talking about a few years ago?
Right, that's an excellent question, Phil. And I think we're at a point in time where it's a combination of be good or doing good, but it's also really important and good for business, sort of doing good and doing well at the same time on a grand scale. And there are some theories out there about why now. One of them is because of the experience with the pandemic. This global crisis that reminded us all of how connected we are and how vulnerable our global economy is something that has weighed on the minds of everyone. It affected everybody. And health and safety were paramount considerations. And the impact on all of our lives was unprecedented, at least in our modern memory. And at the same time, there was an increased call for social justice, equality, and diversity that we haven't seen in years. And really, it reached historic levels. Plus, add to that the extreme weather events of the last few years around the country and around the world, of hurricanes, fires, droughts, flooding, and the polar vortex. And you can't even deny climate change anymore. And so putting all of those factors together sort of forced everyone to start looking at a way to avoid future global crises. And climate risk stands out as one of the largest, if not the largest, risk facing the world and the global economy. And because of the financial risk connected with climate change and the human risk connected with climate change, and on top of that, these calls for social justice and equality increasing, all of those factors came together at the same time to focus the public, investors, shareholders, government on these issues in order to not only do the right thing, but do what's really best for business. Because the future of the financial markets, in light of climate risk, is really moving towards sustainability. And it affects every company across the globe. If they're not moving towards sustainability, they will be left behind. So there is a combination of doing good, as you said, Phil, and doing what they need to financially to survive and thrive in the future.
So one of the things that seems like a really interesting sort of combination, or maybe even conflict between, what is good for business writ large and sort of where your professional life comes in as a commercial litigator. What is good for business? Is good for business something looking decades down the road, or is good for business something that's good for a public company's stock price this week? And how do you juggle the immediacy of stock price watching and marketplace and stock price driven litigation with these like high-minded concepts of long-term business success?
I think it's both short-term and long-term. because companies need to be planning for the future, but they also need to be addressing their shareholder demands today. And one of the ways to do both is to include in your planning for the future how you are going to handle climate risk and other ESG issues, and start expressing that today. Start making those changes today. Start sharing with your shareholders and the public what those plans are. They can be aspirational. You don't have to have today solved all the problems or addressed all of your ESG issues, but the fact that you're looking at them, the fact that you're planning for them, and the fact that you intend to take action down the road that are consistent with those plans is a way to both address the way investors and the public are looking at companies today and the future, because the plans are also going to be, if implemented properly, what helps companies transition to the future of sustainability. So they will be in a position to actually succeed when the time comes that the plans do come to fruition. It won't just be ideas, it will be action. But right now, a lot of what investors and shareholders are looking for are just disclosures and statements as to what companies are doing, what their policies are, and what they plan to do in addition to the actions they're taking immediately. One of the questions you asked is how does the litigation aspect and enforcement aspect fit into this? And I think you can just already see that the public and shareholders are taking it very seriously and have brought securities class actions challenging companies to meet or accusing them of having not met their disclosures as to their plans or commitments to certain ESG issues. So companies need to be careful that they're both thinking through what they're doing, planning for it, and remaining accountable to those plans to succeed and to avoid litigation risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty, and this is, such an interesting area, right? Because I don't know if I can recall or think about in history shareholders having such a profound impact on how companies are going to do business and how they're going to run their businesses, especially kind of thinking strategically, planning. But it's also difficult, right? Because not everyone agrees what should be covered by ESG, because it depends on what constituent group that you may care about. And so some shareholders may care more about climate change, while others may care more about decreasing human trafficking. And all of that falls under this umbrella of ESG. So, one thing that, I think companies have done is think about kind of the principles that they want to implement in their company, and then start thinking about how do we enforce those principles. Interested in your thoughts here, but if you try to actually cover everything under the umbrella of ESG, you're just not going to get any. It seems like you're just going to be not getting anything done there.
I think that's a good point. And depending on the company also depends on where their focus may be, especially if they're more consumer facing or not, what industry they're in, what risks there are in that industry. Some industries, as you know, Matthew, face greater risks with, say, anti-corruption in doing business in foreign companies, and other companies have risks that are closer to home. I think there are some general themes that apply to all companies, like employee policies, human rights, environmental impact. Some companies are going to have a greater environmental impact merely by what they do than other companies where it's a little more incidental. The difference between, say, an energy company that is building a wind farm versus a trucking company that has a fleet of trucks. They both have an environmental impact, but they are different. So I think that you're right. Companies really need to focus on what their core mission is, what their principles are, and then how to implement that and communicate that effectively and accurately.
So thinking about just from a practical standpoint, take a hypothetical company that more or less thinks of itself as doing things the right way, but probably has some room for improvement, but hasn't really looked inward yet to say, okay, what is our ESG approach? How should a company like that go about assessing itself to say, is what we do sufficient? Where can we do more? How do we define what we do in a way that fits into this marketplace of ESG interest?
I think a little bit of what Matthew was just talking about is a place to start, to really look at the core mission and goals of the company, its principles, its industry, its customers, and its shareholders, and define for itself where it wants to be on the ESG spectrum and how it impacts its business. And that would be the starting place. And then coming up with those policies, getting buy-in from the board, from the leadership, and developing policies, developing that mission statement, and coming up with a way to, and this is really a lot also, Phil, and Matthew, in your bailiwick, compliance protocols for ensuring that the company is in fact meeting those needs. There are developing standards internationally for how to determine what ESG metrics should be considered and how to apply them. There is a push in the United States for the SEC to implement regulations, or at least come up with more specific guidance. There is more progress in the UK and the EU on that. But there are guidelines out there to help companies determine where, once they've determined their mission and principles and where their focus is, as Matthew was saying, there are guidelines that exist to help them then craft programs to ensure they're meeting those needs.
Right. And, with the SEC is really an interesting area, because the approach from the United States has really been from a security standpoint, focusing on materiality relating to what an investor should or shouldn't know to make a decision in that company. But here, it really is a shift in a paradigm of focusing on materiality for the overall public and the public good, and how that company is impacting the world around it, right?
I think that's right. But I also think we have to see that a big piece of this, and why the SEC is focusing on it, and we talked about it earlier about the investor and shareholder interest, is because where the money is coming from, the allocation of capital from investors, from shareholders, from asset management funds, is critical as well to how businesses develop and plan for the future. And if investors and shareholders and the public are looking at these issues, both from a doing good, but also because it is the future of good business, then the SEC's focus on that makes a lot of sense, because their job, of course, is to protect the markets and the investors and the investing public. So it seems as though they're moving together in order to make sure that the needs of the public, but also the investors and who want to invest in these companies, are actually being met appropriately and fairly, and the transparency of the disclosures that are being demanded and the accuracy of them help ensure that this movement towards doing well and doing good is actually being monitored properly and regulated appropriately.
And you think one thing to talk about here as well is, let's put aside the doing good aspect. Let's put aside the companies thinking about how they may impact, but why companies should care about this. And one of the things that we were all talking about a few days ago was companies are being asked by shareholder services that have pretty large impacts on soliciting proxies for voting, for instance, on who the board of directors are going to be. And they're asking questions about ESG policies and even rating companies on their ESG, where they rank in their categories, both similar companies and in the area of in their industry, on how seriously they're taking ESG.
Well, one example I think that jumps out is you have among the largest institutional investors deciding that if this is something, or deciding or recognizing, depending on how you want to say it, that this is something that's important to them. And, whether there's a regulator involved or not, the largest institutional investors have real sway in the marketplace. So if a large institutional investor all of a sudden wakes up and says, you know what, I would like the companies where we have a stake to address these issues, chances are the companies that they have stake in will address those issues. And then once those issues are addressed, they're held to their public statements. Then yeah, it's an SEC, definitely an SEC issue, because if you make a material misstatement or omission in describing your program or policies, whatever they may be, you can get in trouble for that.
That's exactly right, Phil. And lots of large investors have woken up in the last few years and said this is something that's important to them, which is one of the reasons it's driving the behavior that companies are taking to invest. And because climate risk is such a factor for financial investments, it's really financial risk and investment risk that these large investors and asset managers are really focused on ensuring that where they're putting their money is not going to be exposed unnecessarily or inappropriately to risk. That is a driving factor in focusing on these disclosures. And that's a driving factor in why the future of the economy is the sustainability economy, because climate risk is just too great of a financial risk to the markets and to companies, and therefore the investors that invest in those companies, to sit back and not sort of impose some discipline on trying to mitigate the risk of climate change on the future.
And we also, we got to acknowledge, though, as part of this, there's also a huge PR issue here, right? In that, you don't want, if you're an institutional investor backed by, other large companies or, significant individuals, you don't want to be caught having invested in a company that some PR nightmare happens.
What you're talking about, Matthew, is reputational risk, right? There's financial risk and reputational risk. So there's the environmental and on the social side. You want to be careful that the companies that you're investing in, or investors want to be careful that the companies that they are investing in are not also putting the company financially at risk because of some negative press associated with poor decisions regarding employees, or think about the Me Too movement, right? That had a significant impact on the financial concerns and even on the stock price of a number of companies when that was sort of at its heyday, and there were a number of securities litigation cases regarding those as well. So there's the environmental risk, and there's also, or I should say, there's the climate risk, but there's also the reputational risk. There's the financial risk and reputational risk. You're absolutely right.
So reputational risk aside, we've talked a lot about the risks and reasons why you engage in ESG and why it's important and how you sort of try to navigate through doing it correctly. What are some things that you've seen or heard about where an organization has just botched it and done it wrong? Like what's the downside risk to messing up ESG stuff?
Well, there's enforcement by regulators for, as you were talking about earlier, making a material misstatement or false or misleading disclosure. And that can come in various ways. It can come specifically with the operations of the company. It can also come with later false or misleading, inaccurate disclosures. For instance, if there were a crisis or there were a situation like a CEO had to step down for some reason, or there was a lawsuit over sexual harassment at a company, and the disclosures that the company made regarding those crises were not accurate or were misleading, that would end up not only potentially with enforcement by the SEC, but definitely securities litigation from shareholders, bringing stock drop lawsuits and alleging that the disclosures of the announcements were false. And it's important to note, it doesn't just have to be the formal disclosures that are made in SEC statements. Marketing statements, public statements can also be used against companies for making misleading statements that are material. So the
one that comes to mind for me is Volkswagen and the emissions scandal, right? They were trying to sell cars based upon reduced emissions with the technology that they were marketing, that these cars were better for the environment. And it turned out those tests were manipulated and a lot of times falsified, and that they were selling cars that weren't really better for the environment. And they were using this movement for more sustainability as actually an advantage in the market. And there they had all of that fallout, right, that you just described.
Right. That's a great example. There's another example of a company that was being sued for sexual harassment across the board at the highest levels, but the company was not forthcoming about the extent of that litigation. It was actually arbitration. And that when it was later discovered that it was a much more far-reaching problem and a much bigger arbitration with a much greater settlement than they had originally disclosed, it was the same idea that even though they had acted as though they were being forthcoming and using their disclosures appropriately to keep their investors informed, in fact, they were doing the opposite. They were misleading them. So it became a much bigger issue. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now, a Goldman Sachs case, where the securities litigation is alleging that Goldman Sachs made generic aspirational statements about its commitment to integrity, which the shareholders are saying are false based on actions that Goldman Sachs had taken. And the question really is an interesting one, because how aspirational can a company be without then opening itself up to risk of litigation or enforcement? So there's a tension here. We're asking companies to make disclosures, to be transparent, to make statements about their commitment to ESG, to the environment, to social issues. And at the same time, we are placing them at risk for either not doing too much or doing too much, saying too much or not saying enough. And I think in some ways, we're putting companies in a very difficult position of wanting to meet these aspirational needs of addressing these issues, but at the same time, not placing themselves in a position where if they don't meet their aspirations, or if they fail to plan correctly, then they are then exposing themselves to litigation risk. I think it's a difficult line to walk.
Maybe one of the things we need to talk about is a little bit like from a company standpoint, like how, we were talking about before, has ESG from a practical standpoint, all of the areas in a company's business that it can affect. So we've been talking a little bit about compliance, but it affects so much more and is much more broad.
Right. I mean, it can go to things as detailed as, we manufacture things. What can we do with our manufacturing process that looks to both be more mindful about the environment and be more mindful about the day-to-day safety of workers, and be more mindful about, shift scheduling, and be more mindful about letting employees, customers, participants in the manufacturing process voice concerns when concerns emerge.
Right. In ESG, it can even come down to considerations in connection with a transaction. For instance, if a company is engaging in a transaction in a area of the world that perhaps is known or has more risk in the ESG situation, whether it is conflict materials in Africa, where there are people dying over companies needing the components coming out of that area, or human trafficking, or manufacturing something in countries where perhaps the labor standards don't meet what we would expect here in the U.S.
And I think all of those things are great examples of ESG considerations. And again, it comes back to knowing the company, knowing what its mission and principles are, what its business model is, and really at every level, considering these ESG factors. As you were just describing, Matthew or Phil, I think it really does this new focus on ESG. When you look at the international recommended guidelines and everything that's being written and said about it, it really does put the onus on companies to sort of look from the bottom to the top as to how they are impacting their environment, both social and physical, and making sure that all the decisions that they're making are taking these factors into account. I think it's impossible for a company to make all the right decisions at all the right times, and especially from the beginning, but it's a process to put those those aspirations into play in the same way that the concept in compliance of internal controls, sort of the tone starts at the top and goes all the way through the company. You need to make sure that all the employees from top to bottom are thinking about these issues and are empowered to speak up about them, to share thoughts and insights so that the management can hear what's really going on, again, at all levels of the company, to ensure that these considerations are being taken into account, even the small business decisions that are made on a daily basis in companies. So I think that's probably the sort of overall way to implement ESG into your company, but getting that message through requires a huge commitment from leadership and the board, and getting that message, down to the levels of the employees on the ground.
We've talked a lot today about what companies are doing, can do, should do, could think about how to approach this. But, we're lawyers at a law firm. What is it that lawyers at law firms can do on this front? And what can companies out there say, we got a lot to do. We got a lot on our plate. Let's outsource some of this. What kind of lawyers can we hire to, go do this for us or make this easier for us?
Lawyers can really be helpful at every stage of this process, whether it's developing energy transition strategies, dealing with environmental regulations, sustainable finance, corporate securities and disclosure requirements, workforce and labor matters, supply chain, procurement issues, litigation dispute resolution, enforcement, all the way to public advocacy and outreach, and obviously compliance and risk management. Lawyers can help companies at every stage in the process with ESG. It is a complex area. It's developing on a daily basis, and turning to lawyers like the multidisciplinary team we have at Bracewell to help navigate that is one way that companies can get some support and lean on some resources.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, for closing with that wrap up, summarizing what really a lot of different people have been, will continue to think about, will need to think about in the future. So thank you for joining us today. Everybody else, thank you for joining us on Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. See you next time.